Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I'm Mike Sfrega. I'm the director of the Polar Institute, and I am very pleased to welcome colleagues from all 8 Arctic nations, as well as the global community to this important inaugural event, the Arctic in 25 Years, first annual International Youth Symposium. We bring this to you under the auspices of the Wilson Center's Polar Institute, but in partnership with Arctic Council Permanent Participants Youth, which is supported by the Arctic Council Indigenous Peoples Secretariat, our colleagues and friends at Arctic Frontiers, as well as the Arctic Youth Ambassadors. I also want to thank Laguna Corporation from the Alaska village of Wainwright for their foundational and continued support of the Polar Institute, and our colleagues at the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute and Canada Institute, as well as our incredible team at the broadcast facility in Washington, D.C. for making this and other programs possible. Today, we are supported by Mr. Jared Thompson and Mr. Tracy Fitzgerald. We thank them always. Let me just say a couple of words about today's program and context. It is appropriate, and I think right, to hold this event over the next 2 days, immediately before the Arctic Council meeting in Reykjavik, Iceland, where we will learn about and in fact celebrate the accomplishments of the Icelandic chairmanship. And then we will welcome the leadership and chairmanship of the Russian Federation. As we all know, the Arctic Council is celebrating its 25th anniversary. And over this period of time, it has become the most consequential international Arctic-focused organization that we have. It provides a critical forum for international dialogue, research, and even a foundation for select but important sets of international binding agreements. It is where the leadership of the 8 Arctic nations gathered to better understand the Arctic, address the dynamic changes occurring in the Arctic, discuss our shared interest in and stewardship of the Arctic, and consider the Arctic that we want and the Arctic that we need. And then the mechanisms that enable Arctic communities to navigate a landscape in transition by working through a set of complexities and realities, perhaps in a continuum that brings us from one that focuses on sustaining in and adapting to a broad range of environmental and social and political and economic and security issues in such a way that we may someday change our narrative from sustainable communities to thriving communities. I am confident the expertise brought together today and over the next 2 days will provide a roadmap toward an Arctic that is thriving, which means taking on the many challenges we face, creating solution sets to address these challenges, and then advancing these solutions through an actionable policy development and implementation plan. So again, it is appropriate that we start off this important week with a focus on the expertise, perspectives, insights, and aspirations of a representative group of Arctic youth. After all, they will shape the future contours of the Arctic. In 25 years, it will be them and their peers who will be in leadership positions, mentoring the next generation of Arctic leaders, governing a new and different Arctic, and hopefully convening the 25th annual Arctic in 25 Years Youth Symposium. So I look forward to hearing from our speakers today, but more importantly, I look forward to learning from them. It is now a pleasure to introduce my colleague, the director of the Arctic in 25 Years Symposium, Miss Michaela Stiff, who serves as the program assistant with the Polar Institute. Michaela, congratulations for taking an idea we discussed, turning that idea into reality, and then creating this important 2-day program. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Mike. And it's also my pleasure to welcome everyone who's watching from around the world, whether it be your morning, afternoon, or evening. I'm calling in from Anchorage, Alaska, where I'm a lifelong resident. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ellen Inga Turri, who is the chair of the board of the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat and has been working as the senior Arctic official from the Sami Council for over 10 years. So Ellen Inga Turri, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michaela. I've actually been working in this role for 6 years, but close enough. Dear participant, participants in this Arctic in 25 years International Youth Symposium, dear Arctic youth, dear Indigenous participants, dear other participants, and also dear Wilson Center organizers. It's an honor for me as the current chair of the Arctic Council Indigenous Peoples Secretariat to bid you welcome to this important event for emerging Arctic leaders. As was already mentioned briefly, I am Sami. I belong to a nomadic reindeer herding family. We have pastures here in northern Norway. And I have been a member of the Sami Council for approximately 10 years now. I've had the pleasure of being Sami Council's head of delegation to the senior Arctic officials level for 6 years now. And I have for the past 2 years been the chair of the board of the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat. This has been a time where I have learned to understand the important role of international cooperation and decision-making to work towards ensuring a good future for our homelands. I'm very glad that we have this symposium today, and I really hope that this will contribute to the involvement of Arctic youth in the important work of Arctic Council for the next 25 years. I expect that I am now looking at the future decision makers in the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council has a long history as the leading intergovernmental forum promoting cooperation, coordination, and interaction among Arctic states, Arctic indigenous peoples, and other Arctic inhabitants on common Arctic issues. And we have focused particularly on issues of sustainable development and environmental protection in the Arctic. Ever since the establishment of the Arctic Council, and perhaps also in the development phases before, the Arctic Council has shown a willingness and ability to include Arctic indigenous peoples in the decision-making processes about Arctic issues. I know of no other international organizations where indigenous peoples' voice, where indigenous peoples' organizations have an equally strong role around the decision-making table. And I believe that this results in that indigenous issues are part of the evaluations behind Arctic Council decisions. As you know, there are over 500,000 indigenous peoples living in the Arctic. They span 3 continents and are in 7 nation states and are in areas that are around 30,000 square kilometers. Therefore, to paraphrase David Bolton, who was the former chair of the senior Arctic officials level during the US chairmanship a few years ago, he said that the Arctic Council would not be the Arctic Council as we know it without the participation of indigenous peoples. To support indigenous peoples' participation in the Arctic Council, we also have what we call the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat, which I am currently chairing the board of. And this secretariat was actually established even before the establishment of Arctic Council. This was established to support the indigenous peoples organizations. We are now 6 that have permanent participant status. And these are the Aleut International Association, the Arctic Athabascan Council, Quechan International Council, Inuit Circumpolar Council, Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, and my organization, the Sami Council. The Indigenous Peoples Secretariat is thus a support secretariat for all the permanent participants, and it assists with creating opportunities for us to present our causes, and provides with necessary information and materials. For example, also for this event, the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat employees have been, as I hear, crucial in helping the organizational part. With the help of the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat and all you youth, I hope and believe that the Arctic Council will continue on a good path, and that that the Arctic indigenous voice remains and is perhaps even strengthened in Arctic decision making over the next 25 years. This is because we, the Arctic indigenous peoples, we are at the forefront of experiencing the global challenges that the world is currently facing. An easy example is climate change, which is occurring much faster and much more extreme in our home regions. While the rest of the world is preparing itself, or while much of the rest of the world is preparing itself for a 2-degree change, we are already experiencing much higher changes than that. I mean, we are up to 8 to 10 degrees change even today. And of course, that means that our livelihoods, we have to adapt and engage our resilience now. And we will have to continue to do this even more in the future. Concurrently with climate change, we of course have all the other challenges as well, such as biodiversity change, land loss, encroachment, and also social issues, for example, ensuring proper living conditions for our peoples. This is why we need you. This is why we need Arctic youth to take action already now and to prepare and be ready to be decision makers also on Arctic issues, and also in the Arctic Council to promote our common work to ensure that we have a good Arctic, livable, sustainable Arctic also in 25 years. I'm therefore very honored to be part of this event today. And I look very much to hear the presentations and discussions today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those welcoming introductory remarks. Now, as we carry on, this will actually be a very good introduction to the next panel, or the very first panel of this event, which is the Arctic Council Permanent Participant Youth Panel. As Ellen Inga said, in the Arctic Council, the permanent participant organizations represent Indigenous peoples from across the Arctic. And while permanent participant status has existed since the founding of the Arctic Council, in fact, the first time all the permanent participants met for their own Arctic Leaders Summit was in 1991, 5 years prior to the founding of the Arctic Council. Arctic Leaders Summits have been venues where the permanent participants can make declarations on issues of common interest, such as environmental protection, sustainable development, and other priority topics for Indigenous communities across the Arctic. Yet the emphasis on youth is quite new. And in 2019, when the permanent participants held their 6th Arctic Leaders Summit, youth gathered alongside them for their very first ever Arctic Leaders Youth Summit. Today we'll discuss the outcomes of the Youth Declaration, of which there were a few major themes such as environment, economic development and infrastructure, food sovereignty, Indigenous knowledge, consultations, culture, language, education, mental health, communication, and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so before we begin to start talking about the declaration, I'd just like to go around and let all of the panelists introduce themselves. We have Eni Samila of the Sami Council, Denali Hodges of the Arctic Athabascan Council, Joshua Vo and Crystal Martin Lipinski of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Ivantrophimov of RIPON, the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, Darling Anderson of Aleut International Association, and Rena Squirrel of Gwich'in Council International. So let's start with you, Eni.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Michaela. So per ehkä puheiden, mulla on uusipaalallistani Jarkko Enni. Good evening, everybody. My name is Eni Simila, and I am the PP Youth Representative of the Sami Council. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers to inviting me to this panel discussion. Thank you. And yes, about me, I am a Sami, and currently I am living in Sápmi, in a small village called Herta, which is close to the Norwegian and Swedish border. And I am a student at Oulu University, where I major Sami culture and Northern Sami language. And I am also working in the Sami Council as a project worker in Interreg funded project called Filling the EU Sami Knowledge Gaps. And I started to work in the Sami Council in 2019 as a trainee. And through that position, I was organizing the first Arctic Youth Leaders Summit in Rovaniemi 2019, together with 4 other Sami youth. And I'm also active in Sami youth organization in the Finnish side of Sápmi called Soma Sami Nuoret. And this year I was re-elected as a chair. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And how about you next, Denali?
Adet Denali Hodges Melinda Chasing David Hodgins to Githernacheg South Naknik Yith Histan Lord Tanana Dene Listo. Good morning, everybody. My name is Denali Hodgson. I am from the villages of Anvik and South Naknik on the Yukon River and in Bristol Bay. I'm currently living in Lower Tanana Dene lands in what is known as Fairbanks, Alaska. However, I'm calling in from Tlingit Ani or Tlingit lands down here in Juneau, Alaska this morning. I sit as a permanent participant youth representative for the Arctic Athabascan Council and am the executive director of On the Land Media. It's wonderful to see you, Mike and Michaela and Jack, and I know that Marisol is also calling in on the line. I actually got my start in many ways in Arctic work by working at the Wilson Center's Polar Institute. So it's wonderful to be seeing these two worlds emerge and converge together, and to be welcoming all the other youth permanent participants here this morning. So Hajigadistan, and looking forward to the conversation.
We're very happy to have you back, Denali. Next, we will have the representatives from the Inuit Circumpolar Council introduce themselves. Joshua, would you like to go first, and then Crystal?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Michaela. My name is Joshua Vo. I live and work here in Anchorage, Alaska. I'm the permanent participant representative for the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Alaska. I'm very excited to be here today to discuss the various panel questions with our youth around the world, and thank you again for having me.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good day to everybody. I'm Crystal Martin Lipinski, and I am the president for the National Inuit Youth Council here in Canada, and also the Inuit Circumpolar Council's emerging leader. I am so thrilled to be here today and to have this type of dialogue with the Indigenous youth of the Arctic. It's a pleasure to see everybody. I know it's been a couple of years since we last met in Finland, but it's really great to see everybody virtually. And I'm looking forward to having some great conversations here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll note as we move on to our next participant, who is Ivantrophimov, that in fact, we have translation services going today. Ivan will be speaking in Russian, but those of you who are listening at home will be listening to translated audio in English. And Ivan is also receiving Russian translation for the other panelists here today. So Ivan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Добрый вечер, дорогие друзья, товарищи.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, dear friends. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this very important panel. And I think that we as the indigenous youth of Russia are pretty sure that our agenda is very topical. And I think that today's program is very interesting, and I'm really happy to see the emerging youth leaders of the permanent participants. And we do see how important our agenda is, and I hope that we will have a very fruitful discussion today. And the indigenous youth of Russia, RIPON, will be participating in most projects, and I would like to highlight that our top priority right now is the International Symposium in the light of the upcoming chairmanship. And today I have Artur Akateto with me from RIPON. And we will try to highlight the most topical issues for us, the issues related to the Arctic regions, and I hope we will be able to make up some conclusions today. Thank you.
Thank you. Spasibo большое. We'll have Artur speaking on the next panel as well, which is about sustainable development and infrastructure. So the last speaker, last but not least, will be Rena Squirrel from the Gwich'in Council International.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Here it is morning, so I'll say Van Gwinzi Shilakat. My name is Rena Squirrel. I am Tetley Gwich'in from Tetley. My grandmother is from Old Crow, Yukon, and she is a Vantak Gwich'in. I'm currently located on Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, Alberta, here in Canada. I recently graduated from the University of Alberta with a Bachelor of Arts degree in Native Studies and a Bachelor of Secondary Education with a Native Studies major. So my original, what brought me to Edmonton was to go to school. I'm originally from the Northwest Territories, and we plan to move back up here eventually. But yeah, I grew up outside of the settlement area, the Gwich'in settlement area, and I feel like just lately I'm really learning more about my roots as a Gwich'in person, learning my language with my children. I got two little ones, a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. They might run into the camera at some point, so I'm just warning you guys now. But yeah, I'm so happy to be here. I recently started working with the Basking Council International as the project coordinator. A lot of my position is around food security and also energy initiatives. Two topics I'm so passionate about, and I'm so happy to be here with everyone, and yeah, to learn what everyone else has to say, and yeah, masitro. Thank you.
Thank you. And I spoke too soon by saying last. We have Darling Anderson here from Aleut International Association. We're excited to welcome you. Please introduce.
Anklach huzujich unangam tinu iland natoch asachtukuk amelayam tinu iland darling asachtukuk isnam lagana nechtukuk unangach akuk Anchorage or Anchorage ilan anaragizak unangam ula ilan awazak Thank you everyone for having me here today. My Unangach name is Chinatuch. I'm Unangach from Falls Pass, Alaska, and I currently live in Anchorage, Alaska on Denali Athabascan land. I'm the youth representative for Aleut International Association. I also work for Aleutian Pribilof Islands Association as the cultural coordinator here, and I'm currently spending a lot of time learning my Indigenous language, Inuktitut, and working as a regional team to preserve our language.
Thank you. So with everyone here today, some of you already have known each other and met each other in person in Rovaniemi, Finland in 2019. Many of you have been working together since then. So after hearing each other introduce yourselves, is there any remarks that you'd like to make, or should we jump right into questions? Okay, we'll jump in. The very first thing that really jumps out to me that I think is really important about this discussion is that many of you have some of your mother tongue and were speaking it to introduce yourselves. As we know, the languages we speak really form our worldviews and identity. And so I'm wondering, from each of your regions in the Arctic, where do you see your mother language being written or spoken? And where do you think it could be better utilized? Anyone can take it away.
I'll jump in. So for Inuit here in Canada, the Inuktitut is a very strong language, particularly Inuktitut, which is spoken majorly by Inuit in the eastern part of Canada. You know, we've been fairly lucky in a sense that our traditional language is still strong in many of our communities. Where Inuktitut is the language that children and youth are speaking at home. But there's also a lot of risks that are involved as well, where English is such a predominant language in Canadian society that many children and youth are hearing English every single day on TV, or, you know, if they have non-Inuit or non-Inuktitut speakers that are educators, for example. However, there's still, you know, other dialects that within the Inuit language that are being revitalized. That have been lost due to colonization. There's many efforts that are being put into place by regional Inuit organizations, you know, providing language programming in the communities, offering language classes in schools to try and revitalize and strengthen our language. I think we've been fairly lucky so far. However, I do caution that though we may be lucky that we still do have our language, we're still at risk of losing our language. And so it's so important to ensure that people are open to speaking Inuktitut, whatever dialect it is that they're in. You know, if it's somebody within the community, you know, it's so hard. Like for me, my first language is Inuktitut. I spoke this. It's the only language I knew up until I was around 10 years old. And then we moved from my home community of Nunavut, Canada to Southern Canada, whereas now I'm speaking English all the time. And it makes it very challenging. I can speak Inuktitut. I'm not fully fluent, but I have the ability to communicate still in Inuktitut. So I'm trying to teach my children at home the language and the importance of keeping that. However, we are also very limited as well in terms of resources. Particularly in Southern Canada, this is something that a lot of Inuit are plagued with in accessing programs or services that are in Inuktitut, because this is not our home community, this is not our region. So we don't necessarily have access to certain services that impact us, whether this is within the healthcare system, the education system, justice system. Really anywhere you go, it's all in English. And so there's a lot of concerns in that regard. But there's definitely a lot of efforts being put into place by our regions to try and revitalize this, or to try and provide more access that is Inuit specific and within the language of choice as well. But I think, for all of us, language is something that is so important, and our elders are the language carriers, they're the language holders, and so it's so important to keep that connection as well, and spending more time with our elders, especially out on the land, so that we can understand the traditional words, because I think the language has changed over time, in terms of whether this is from an environment perspective, or because the climate has changed so much. There's so many words that Inuit used to have that we don't hear anymore, because maybe that's non-existent anymore. So there's a lot of different things happening, and I'm just so grateful that our regions have been so open to ensuring that our language is strong in our communities.
I think that's really that you highlighted that, in fact, Indigenous languages do hold a lot of knowledge about the environment that we're living in the Arctic. And as the Arctic changes, that may change the language, but also the language itself has a lot of knowledge that we can glean about the changes that we see in the Arctic environment. Would anyone else like to speak to language home regions? Darling?
Yeah, I'll go right ahead. So our language, Inuktitut, currently has 2 major dialects. Unfortunately, we've lost several dialects just over the years. And we do recently have a really strong program going where we're able to do a lot more immersion time, but a lot of our people don't live in the region, and especially living here in Anchorage, we don't have an opportunity to speak our language as often as we'd like. But I've been really grateful to be able to spend a majority of my work time being able to learn my language and take that out to our communities that don't have that language anymore. We have a lot of fluent understanders. Our extremely fluent speakers are aging, and often a lot of us are trying to take off the burden of teaching those languages. So trying to ramp up Indigenous language teachers in our region. And often a lot of times people assume just because you speak the language, you know how to teach the language. And especially with such a small group of people who have the ability to really understand our language, it's an even smaller group of people who are able to teach that language to more people. But I have been really grateful in the past 4 or 5 years to really focus on our Indigenous language, Inuktitut. I didn't have an opportunity to learn the language a lot growing up. My mother didn't speak the language, just know things here and there. But just recently I got done with a workshop working specifically on our language for the last 2 weeks, and it's just been so refreshing to be able to really understand my elders better, to have dreams with our language in it, and it's just been really uplifting, and I can really see in a lot of our youth they're eager for it.
It's really great to hear that you were able to learn your language in work, and the revitalization initiatives are happening around the Arctic. So as people go around, if they'd also like to speak to the revitalization initiatives like Darling did, then you are welcome to do so.
Yeah, I can elaborate on that. As I mentioned in my introduction, I grew up outside of the Gwich'in settlement area, so there wasn't a whole lot of other Gwich'in people that, even if I did want to learn the language, I didn't have anybody that I could communicate with. And so it wasn't until recently that I really started taking it serious, trying to learn my language. There's about 9,000 Gwich'in people in Canada and Alaska. And of that amount, there's I would say 300 or 400 speakers of our language. So there's an urgency to learn it. And as I mentioned too, I'm in Edmonton, Alberta. So it's still kind of tough to learn, but there is a language app that I've been learning off of. Just recently, we started weekly Zoom meetings where we would learn the language. A lot of the people are back in Inuvik or Fort McPherson. And so it's just a really fun way for all of us to connect. And, learning with my kids is amazing. Like, especially if I teach them something and they use it throughout the day. Like if my oldest son would tell his little brother, Dadinu. Dadinu means be quiet. So he's telling his brother these things now, and it just melts my heart every time. But I noticed with my 4-year-old, like he's at the age too where like he picks up words really fast, and sometimes it's easier for him to say the Indigenous word than the English word. And we have Dinjiju. Dinjiju is the name of our language. We have signs throughout our house of how to say milk, or to how to say shoes or socks. And so we're trying to do what we can in our household to learn the language. And eventually, we're always going to be connected with our community somehow. So I'm just hoping that my vision, one day is my family and I, we'll talk to each other in our language, but then we'll also go back up north and talk with other friends and family up there. But we find a lot of strength in learning our language and are really proud of it. Masi.
I'm glad the little ones are getting the opportunity to learn and carry on that tradition. As we're moving from, as we spoke about earlier, we have the Icelandic chairmanship of the Arctic Council switching over to the Russian chairmanship of the Arctic Council just this month. And one part of the chairmanship that we understand will be important is that we are in the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. So I wonder, Ivan, on your side of the world, what sort of action have you been seeing around the International Year of Indigenous Languages, if you don't mind speaking towards that?
Вы знаете, мы лидеры молодежи, наше движение.
As Indigenous youth of Russia, we have organized several conferences on the language preservation. And in the first place, for us, it is the exchange of experiences and best practices, because the language, it's the basics of our livelihood, of our traditions, and especially for the nomadic families, it is part of our traditional livelihoods and our families. And in February 2021, one of our colleagues developed an app to study the Evenki language, and it is simultaneous interpretation between Evenki and Russian. And we have a lot of initiatives like that in Russia, developing apps and websites, because it creates a wonderful opportunity for the young people to learn the language and to preserve the language in the first place. And we have a project on digitalization, on linguistic and cultural diversity of the Arctic. And it is one of the priorities, I guess, for this decade of Indigenous languages. Because today we have a lot of devices and gadgets, and there are so many technical opportunities to study languages via apps. And we are going to make it a part of our agenda, digitalization of the languages, and we are going to preserve the endangered languages. And I would like to express my gratitude to our elders who keep on the languages right now. And thanks to modern technologies, we can study indigenous languages, not only the Evenki language that I mentioned, but many more. And that's why we hope that all the indigenous language of the world will be revitalized and preserved and developed. And us, the young people, we have to be responsible for that. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's really important to think about how we are combining these ancient languages with modern technology and propagating them. And that makes me want to turn it over to Annie to talk about your language, because I know that in Sapmi you have a university where the courses are taught in Northern Sami, and there's other digital solutions as well. So I'll ask you to elaborate more on that.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, we have possibility to study different Sami languages in university. I myself am studying Northern Sami in university, but unfortunately that is not possible in all the different Sami languages. So we have 9 different Sami languages, and inside those languages we have multiple dialects. So unfortunately, it is not possible in all those, but hopefully someday. But I wanted I saw that there are a lot of similarities that the previous speakers were talking about that are also in Sapmi. And one thing that I started to think was when Crystal talked about how the language has changed, and that is actually mentioned in our declaration, that how our indigenous languages should be part of our everyday life. But the languages are changing all the time, and our way of life is kind of also changing. And sometimes we face situation when we are lacking the words, and we have to create or find out new words to our languages. I also almost every day I think, okay, how could I say this in Northern Sami? And actually in Sapmi we have this institution who is creating all the time new Sami languages in different to all these different Sami languages. And I think that is a really great way to keep our language alive, and also that way encourage the youth to use the languages, because if we don't have the words to express ourselves in the modern life, then I don't know if the youth are going to use the languages, our languages, because they are unable to express their feelings or themselves. So yes, I think that was my main point. And just to mention about the indigenous, the decade of the indigenous people's languages, I think there are a lot of amazing projects ongoing. And one example from Sapmi that we had was this writing competition for Sami youth, and they were able to participate in every different Sami language that they wanted to participate, and the only requirement was to write in Sami. So that way we wanted to encourage the youth to use the Sami languages, and not to think about if the language is perfect or if all the words are correct, but just to use it. Yeah, so Yes, thank you.
Thank you. No, I think that was a good roundtable. Joshua, I'll let you jump in if you want to speak to this question.
Yeah, I can add a little bit. It's kind of like how Annie had mentioned, there's a lot of common themes throughout the other countries and what we've got going on here in Alaska. There's a big push for revitalization of Inuit language, and there's real hunger for youth that weren't, traditionally raised around it to learn it and to, continue to learn it. So like the other countries and people here, it's a lot of the same similar situations.
Yes, and what it sounds like is that there's a lot of knowledge embedded within the languages. The languages are always changing. And so it's important from a policy perspective to have funded revitalization initiatives and also to provide opportunities to be speaking your Indigenous languages in your everyday lives, where you're living both inside your territories, but also when you have to move to the South for school or for work. So thank you all for those. And I will switch it a little bit because any the declaration. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was wondering if I could speak a little bit to
Athabascan.
Please do. So with Athabascan language, what you heard from my introduction was a little bit of Deg-Nog, which is actually one of 12 distinct dialects only on the Alaska side of the Athabascan language family. And so what is exciting about the Athabascan or Nakhtene language family is that we actually extend throughout the areas known as Canada and into other areas of Turtle Island and are related to our Diné relatives or Navajo relatives in the lower 48. There's so many directions that we can take this conversation regarding language. And as you mentioned, there are many similarities. So I'll just highlight two of the initiatives that are ongoing. We have many initiatives that are started by some of our Alaska Native corporations and Alaska Native villages. Doyon Foundation in particular has been funding a lot of the Doyon region language initiatives, such as the one that is being headed by Dr. Laverne Dementif for Deg-Nog, or the language that I was speaking earlier. And then Otna is also doing a lot in their region as well, particularly highlighting their immersion school, which is called Yaneda'a, and it's an immersion school for elementary students. And so if you look at what is happening in Alaska, like I get so excited every time I hear from Yaneda'a because it means that we have, next generation that are able to not only learn and be in the language every day, but also have all of the education that comes from learning your language interwoven into maybe more of a standard Western education system as well. So how are we really bringing together both educations so that young people can move forward with the worldview that English provides and the worldview that our own languages provide. Another initiative that was really exciting, or a project that is being headed by Willis Yaniver, is Dene Yati, which is actually a podcast that we just heard from during one of our during our podcasting project that we're working on right now. And Willis interviews everybody in the Dene language on a podcast, and he said part of the reason to that was that people could hear the language in a modern technological form and have it be incorporated into everyday life. So really discussing some of the current political issues that we're facing, as well as just everyday things that impact community members during his podcasting sessions. So that's something that I'm really excited about, is how are we bringing maybe some of these more forms or methods, such as audio recording that was done by anthropologists and elders, which really preserved our languages, and then maybe more modernizing or contemporizing those forms.
That's awesome. And it's also interesting to note about the public-private partnerships in really funding the revitalization initiatives as well. there's many different ways that they can be done, is what I'm hearing. Great. So as I said, we'll switch gears a little bit. You know, we hear that there's a lot of similarities in, especially with languages across the Arctic, but there's probably other similarities as well. And so I was wondering, for those of you who gathered in 2019 in Finland, what was your biggest takeaway from coming together as a circumpolar group of Indigenous peoples? What similarities and differences did you notice from being around each other? And what was the value of that collaboration?
I don't want to keep going first, but I'll jump in. It was such an empowering time. For me, it was really my first experience, having different conversations with Indigenous groups across the circumpolar region. And for myself, it was this eye-opener of how similar and common challenges we shared, and how, our approach has always been land-based, environment-based, and having respect for the environment, the land, and your people. So, the first time I wasn't really sure what to expect, to be honest. I was very new in my role for the National Inuit Youth Council and with ICC. So I was still trying to get my feet wet a little bit with that. And then adding the trip to Finland was an opportunity that it really kind of brought everything together and it made sense. And I spent time with ICC, the ICC president for, not ICC president, for Inuit leaders that came there, Baututik Inuit Women of Canada and Nunaat Sabut President Johannes. And I really got time to, I had this opportunity to ask them questions, to learn about their experience. It was almost like this mentorship, and they're like, oh, this has been my experience, and this is, kind of our approach. And so it was a really great opportunity in that sense to have that one-on-one time with Inuit leaders. And then on top of that, to spend time with Indigenous youth of the Arctic, to better understand their needs, their challenges, or their best practices, and what their communities are doing to, whether this is from, a localized perspective, what they're doing in their communities or their regions, or even within their country. It was absolutely empowering. It was so inspirational. It was motivational. It was everything in between that you can think of. Really, it was a phenomenal job. And I really thank those that facilitated that for their time and their effort in bringing everybody together. Because it is, we do have this common, we have so much commonalities just in terms of sustaining our communities and, the socioeconomic aspect of our lives and socio-cultural aspect of our lives. And there's just so much commonalities. And I think there's this, you can bridge these gaps when you have that relationship. So building relationships now, I think, is so important. It was mentioned earlier, we're the future leaders of our people. This is why we're here. We want to continue this engagement. We want to have these relationships so that someday, if we do end up, in those kinds of positions, we've already built a solid, trusting relationship with our Indigenous brothers and sisters across the circumpolar region, and understand, the various challenges and know, what work has been done before. So you've kind of got that history as well. So it's been inspiring for me and such a humbling and amazing experience to be part of.
That's lovely to hear. And I think that you're right, that relationships are really a huge part of everything that we do, but it's also when we're thinking in terms of policy, that growing our relationships between peoples across borders is a huge part of being able to make things happen and create the policies that we want to see. And many of you have been working together since the declaration as well, outside of Rovaniemi during this COVID-19 pandemic, been working remotely. So how have you all been working together? Maybe we can start with Annie, and others might want to chime in.
Yes, I just want to mention that Crystal said kind of everything that I was also thinking and feeling after the AYLS. It was an amazing event, and it's hard to understand that that was the first official gathering of the Arctic Indigenous youth. So I think it was about the time to happen. But yes, I think in that event, we all felt that we don't want it to be only like once in a lifetime event, and that we want to continue our collaboration after that, and we want to continue working together. And like Kristen said, that we noticed that there are a lot of challenges and concerns that we share, and that those solutions can also be similar, and that we want to work together towards those solutions. And after that, yes, in there we wanted to create something permanent, and we established this Arctic Council, Arctic Youth Council Network. I think the name changed, and I think we didn't kind of decide what will be the exact name, and that we want to, through that network, we want to continue our work. And then quite soon after that, we heard from PPs that they have decided to establish PP Youth Network, and that idea was the follow-up from the AYLS, and that they had seen how eager and willing we are to take part of their work, and we want to be included, and we want to get our voices heard, and we are not only the future, but we are already now, and we wanted to be part of our future in the Arctic. So they saw our strong representation in Rovaniemi, and follow up from that, they wanted to take us to the PP work, and then the PP youth representatives were elected, and I think we had our first meeting we were just talking about this last week. When was the first meeting? I think it was in April or May. I think April. Maybe someone can help me with the concrete date. But yes, since that, we have been part of, yes, 2020, sorry, 2020 in April. Yes, of course, the first steps were to get to know the work of the PPs, and to get into their work, and to also get to know Arctic Council's work, and to think like what do we want to achieve, and what is our position. But after that, we are full speed, and actually currently we are running the first joint project, a storytelling initiative, and maybe Denali can tell more about that project, but it's part of the 25th anniversary of the Arctic Council. But yes, I will stop there, and if someone else wants to fill me up, please do it.
Yeah, Denali, would you like to tell us about the podcasting project a little?
Yeah, I thank you, Annie, for going over all that history. It's crazy that we're already calling it history as well. And considering that it has been 2 years since our first meeting, and oh yeah, we, as Annie has mentioned, we are working now on a joint project underneath Indigenous People Secretariat, and are thankful to have the blessings of the permanent participants and the guidance of the permanent participants during this project. We are looking at celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Arctic Council. And so we're gathering together youth from across our region, permanent participant youth, as well as other youth from across our regions, to speak to the stories from each of our distinct areas and receive mentorship from different media experts, storytelling experts from across our region. We know that we have been storytellers since time immemorial, and we have always orated our knowledge. And so we've chosen podcasting as a form to kind of educate in many ways on the Arctic Council and be able to disseminate, what the Arctic Council is for those people across our regions that don't know or haven't had access to high-level forums such as this. And then I think that there's a really creative aspect of it as well, where youth from across our region can highlight what stories they want to really bring to the forefront and say, this is what's important to us right now. This is what we see in the Arctic, and this is how we want the future of the Arctic to be shaped. So we're really trying to highlight some of this, story or this history of how the Arctic Council came to be, how the Youth Permanent Participant Network came to be, and make space for youth to join us, as well as then speaking to, kind of this imagination or what we want to see implemented in the policy arena, in the academic arena, in our communities.
One of the topics that is discussed in the Arctic Council and seems of particular importance to the permanent participants and the youth around this panel is about food sovereignty and security. As we know, traditional food practices are fundamental to food security and core to Arctic identities. I think that's a quote directly from your 2019 declaration. So what are some practical ways to increase Indigenous people's control over the practice and development of their livelihoods? Have you seen or heard of successful initiatives? This is for anyone who'd like to answer, but perhaps we'll start with Rena.
Yes, for sure. Thank you. So as I was going to university, my summer job was the community garden program coordinator in the Northwest Territories. So I traveled to all 33 communities to work with the community to grow their own food and to develop a community garden. And it was the best summer job ever. I loved it so much. I learned so much too. And when I explain my work, like what I do to people like down south, they're just like, what? Like, you can't grow stuff in the Arctic? But I explain, like, we have 24-hour sunlight in the summertime. So our growing season is shorter, but it's because of the 24-hour sunlight, it's a great growing season. And it was just like, it was just so I see the benefit of it. We have people who are hunting and fishing off the land already. And if we were to incorporate a community garden, that would help, get us closer to being, towards food security. And it's something that is still continuing today. There are still communities out there that grow enough potatoes for like the whole community for the winter. And I just see a lot of potential in in going this route. And that's what I'm really excited about, working with the Gwich'in Council International. This is going to be a big part of my work, is reaching out to the Gwich'in communities and seeing exactly where everyone is at in regards to food security. And, what can we do to enhance that? But yeah, no, I see a lot of value in growing your own food. Like right now at the grocery stores in the north, like food is so expensive, especially for, fresh fruits and vegetables. It's almost non-existent. And it's not fair for people to be subjected to that. Like diabetes and, heart disease is a big one in our communities. And I think that by growing our own food and, trying to maintain a traditional diet is going to help in that area. But yeah, I just wanted to share that. And yeah, definitely pro food security. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's that's really important to highlight that yes, we can grow food in some places, and the veggies are sweeter. The carrots are yummier when they grow up here in 24-hour sunlight. And in addition to that, people have traditional livelihoods like hunting and reindeer herding, as Yvonne mentioned. So would anyone like to speak to that angle of food security?
This is Darling. I just go really quick. Like my people in Unalaq are, we heavily rely on fishing for a lot of our food security. But recently we have had the opportunity to bring in more greenhouses into our communities. So we don't, very similar. It's not, it doesn't snow very much where I'm from, but it rains a lot and we have a lot of storms. Some similar situation with the stores, along with food security. We also need our economic sovereignty, and it can be so difficult for people with the limited amount of jobs to be able to afford healthy foods in those regions. A lot of our food is coming in by barge, and when they get food on the barge, it's in Seattle. It's usually never fresh when it ends up here. So increasing the ability of our, food and land sovereignty, be able to not have an unnecessary amount of oversight over our hunting practices, and not, people are really trying to have an understanding of why we have this connection with our land and with our food and why it's so important to who we are as people, I think is really important.
It is, thank you. I'd just like to drop in while you all are thinking for the audience that we will be taking questions from the audience in the later half of the panel. So please send your questions to polar@wilsoncenter.org. It's polar@wilsoncenter.org. And yeah, go ahead, Denali.
Yeah, I'll just hop in here. Sorry, I always wait. Terrible Zoom.
You can jump in whenever.
I can't wait till we can be in person. Yeah, I think that's something that's really important and that I've been grappling with. And I know a lot of people across our regions have been grappling with is what does it look like to navigate these spaces, these policy spaces, or are the lives that we live within the current economic capitalist apparatus that we're in addition to practicing our subsistence and our food practices. And that for me is kind of the crux of food sovereignty that we are facing right now. I have family members that have a hard time being able to take time off of work in order to go back home to practice our subsistence life ways, whether that is fishing or moose hunting or berry picking. And what does it mean not to be able to fill up your freezer and then have to get caught in the system where you're needing to go to a 9-to-5 job in order to put food on the table. And we know that food prices right now are only going up. So this conversation around how do we increase food sovereignty in the Arctic, whether that is our subsistence practice and being able to truly practice that life way, because it is something that, that's knowledge that needs to be continued. And the only way that it's going to be continued is if you have a fish on your table and you're able to cut it and you're able to go through that entire process of hanging your strips. And that can include, and in many ways, often brings in aspects of language revitalization and discussions around policy and discussions around governance. And that's how we teach. So that's crucial. And then the other aspect that, I think Rena was really speaking to is how do we grow our food? How do we grow in the Arctic? And we know that we can. And so how are we designing community gardens or spaces where people feel comfortable and encouraged to really grow these seeds? And we can see that many of our communities do this. So how are we investing in the infrastructure and in a community practice that allows people to grow carrots, to grow cabbage, and some of these other foods that come from farther south. So I think, if there's any two takeaways that are really at the forefront of my mind, is this, this practicing these traditional life ways and having the time to do it away from the economic system that we're in, which will ultimately allow for the true stewardship of our lands from both a traditional practice as well as the stewardship that we can see within an agricultural system that is much more aligned with a living and healthy, breathing waters and lands.
Thank you. I think as we talk about all of these diverse issues, from language to food security, that one principle that really goes throughout these when we're talking about policy making are the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. I've also heard quite a bit, nothing about us without us, and other full consultation principles. So would you all elaborate a little bit more on what those are and what they mean, how people should think about them when they're thinking about policy? Go ahead, Ivan.
Я бы хотел продолжить тему
I would
продовольствия.
like continue on food security in terms of hunting, because I think it's a very topical issue. And I think one of the most topical issues on the Russian agenda is the development of the Northern Sea route, because in this case, we will have the annual supply for the Arctic indigenous peoples. It is necessary to develop aviation, both on the country level, on the national level, and on the regional level. And as for the traditional livelihoods and hunting, it is a part of our life. It is the basics of our life. And in this regard, I think we shouldn't think about the money, how much it will cost us, but those who are engaged in traditional livelihoods, they should get support from the state. And as of February 7, 2022, Russia is planning to introduce the system to make a census of all the indigenous peoples who live on the territory of Russia. And thus we would like to pass several acts to support the Arctic indigenous peoples in developing of their traditional livelihoods. Because in this case, they will be able to get benefits for hunting, for fishing, and other privileges in this regard. And that's for the food security for the Arctic indigenous peoples. I think it's a very topical issue for us. And we as permanent participants, as the youth leaders, I think we should discuss developing aviation in the Arctic and the development of the Northern Sea route, because it should be general purpose aviation for the most remote areas of our country. Because in Russia, there are 8 large regions that belong to the Arctic zone, and we are trying to promote this agenda. And I hope that together with the dialogue, with the consultation, we will be able to attain this, both in our country and beyond Russia. And I hope it will be a vital part of the Russian agenda in the Arctic Council and as part of the declaration that we have already discussed. If we adopt this clause in the declaration promoting food security, I think it will be a great opportunity for us, for the young leaders, to act. And that's why I'm really proud to be here with you. I'm really honored to discuss these topical issues. And I hope we will be able to promote fruitful dialogue in the future as well. Here in Russia, we do have experience in these matters. And I think that only through dialogue and negotiations, we will be able to resolve the most Arctic indigenous issues. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a really important what you bring up about the actual supply chains for food as well. Those of us in Anchorage, Darling, here with me, will see we have the largest float plane airport in North America right here, because a lot of food is being shipped out to our rural communities. And so it is really important to have the support both to transport food and to be able to sustain traditional lifestyles, as Denali talked about, that people have to work as well and need to have some sort of income. And so it is crucial that there's some sort of support to continue these traditional lifestyles and food practices. That is great. So this is one of the central policy issues, is food security. And I wonder, would anyone like to speak next to the principles of free, prior, and informed consent, and actually other central policy issues that you'd like to bring up?
I can start if anyone else doesn't want to. Yes, when talking about FPIC, first thing that comes to my mind is that we should be able to say no, or we should have the possibility to say no. As we know, the interest to the Arctic has grown quite enormously during due to the climate change and the rapidly melting Arctic. And there are all the time new infrastructure plans, renewable energy projects, mines, etc., planned to our homeland that are threatening our way of life. We are all the time trying to adapt to the changing environment, to the climate change. And addition to that, at the same time, these new industrial developments are approaching. So we are attacked from all the ways. And our life depends on the land and to the connection with the land. And if there is no land, there is no us. Our culture and livelihoods and the way of life are interconnected. with the land. So it's our base of life. And in these cases, these industrial developments, or that I mentioned before, the projects that could harm that connection and could harm our cultures, we should have the right to say no to those plans. And instead of just having a dialogue, to have actual possibility to be part of the decision making and be part of the planning processes already at an early stage, and not only to bring the ready plan to us and like, okay, we know that this will be harmful for you, but we have already made all the plans. Well, for example, in Sápmi, we are threatening to lose our land to renewable energy productions, such as windmill parks and mines and infrastructure. And these industrial developments would be fatal to our way of life. Reindeer herding and these such industrial projects in the traditional grazing lands, they cannot coexist. So there are no solutions that can be made, or if there are solutions, we are the ones to cost with our culture. And I think that if we want to be able to live in the Arctic the way that we and our ancestors have lived, and if we want to see our future generations to be able to live in the Arctic, things need to change, and we have to be able to affect to our life when it is about our future and our way of life. And I think these are all interconnected. If we lose our way of life, if we lose our traditional livelihoods, we lose our languages, we lose our food sovereignty. So they are all connected. Thank you.
Thank you. They are absolutely connected. And what I heard really prominently there is that we do have to have free, prior, and informed consent, but that also means that not just to be told and say yes, but also have the right to say no. Thank you for that. Joshua, what about you? Would you like to elaborate a bit on Nothing About Us Without Us and FPIC?
Yeah, I think Annie did a great job of kind of explaining how we feel about, PIC and the importance of actually saying no. Because historically, a lot of times, not every time, but a lot of times, projects or type of development, with Indigenous people, you kind of get told what's happening versus being involved and having the option to choose whether stuff like that happens. So just being involved in the conversations and the planning of, any type of, development or whatnot is vitally important for, I think, the Indigenous communities, and that, that continues to happen as, the Arctic is, like Annie had mentioned, gaining more interest around the world from, various countries and whatnot. So I think, the ability to participate and have your voice heard and you're being able to express your concerns and actually see, actions taken on your concerns is very important. And I think that, as we continue to move forward, that we continue to do that.
Great. We have about 10 minutes left in our discussion here. So I am wanting to set the stage for the rest of the 2-day symposium that we're going to have. You all are the very first panel, and I think that's very fitting as you are the First Nations in the Arctic. The next panels that we're going to have will be on infrastructure and sustainable development, on climate change and biodiversity action and research, and on political leadership. And based on our discussion today, it really seems like all of those issues are topical to you and things that you have spoken about already. So my question is that one of the final statements in your declaration from 2019 was, we encourage the change of mindset from Western to Indigenous for all peoples. So when we're thinking about sustainable development, infrastructure, climate change, and biodiversity action and research, and in politics and policy, what do you think that would look like? What are some of your ideas for how we might move in that direction in the next 25 years? And anyone can jump in here.
Знаете, я скажу.
Yes, let me comment on that. That's true. That's the major outcome of our work is the declaration. And we see that the declaration shall not only encompass all the current issues, but it shall also aim for the future. And here, I would like to thank all our colleagues, the youth leaders and the permanent participant youth. We agreed at our meetings that we are talking not only about the declaration and its text, but also about the plan of implementation of those decisions that we put in this declaration. For us, as the young leaders representing the permanent participants, this is a chance to show the particular steps that we can take in order to resolve all these issues. And I think that this is our major objective. We shall not only propose something, we shall also do something. We shall take particular concrete steps in order to implement it. We shall address these proposals and these particular steps to the states, to the business, to the academic society. And this shall be the reflection of our vision about the future, where we want to move. We need to think about the forthcoming years and think of a concrete plan of action, the implementation of those provisions that we include into the declaration. So if we take this approach, then we will show that we are not only talking ardently from high podiums, but we are competent professionals. We are leaders. We can suggest agenda and the means of implementation of this agenda. So we shall not only talk about the problems, we should also think about the ways to resolve them. I want to thank my colleagues, the Secretariat for the Indigenous Peoples, for their support of our position. And we suggest that we need to plan our actions, and each permanent participant shall work on this. And we need to regularly update such a plan of implementation. And if we continue working in this way, if we will continue updating this plan based on our discussions, panel sessions, then we will really have a robust plan that will work for the Arctic youth. And this is the contribution that we can make. We will show that we are professionals, and thus we will transit from just a unit into a more professional movement. I think this is important to follow this path, and I want to thank all of you for your work. I think that within this panel, we've already mentioned all the major issues that we want to resolve, and they are common challenges that are shared within the Arctic region. The future is up to us. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's exactly right. I mean, you see all the people standing before you, sitting before you, are strong leaders and professionals and have the knowledge and expertise to be able to talk about policy issues. That's one of the main takeaways from this symposium. Anyone else briefly?
If I may, I concur with everything that Ivan has said. I had goosebumps as he was speaking, and I could really feel his passion and his passion for his people and passion for the Arctic and the need for change. I'd like literally had goosebumps head to toe. And I think our leaders have so much more patience than we do, to be totally honest with you. No, because our leaders before us and the leaders now have been so consistent with messaging, so open about here are the challenges and here are the solutions and here's how we can get through it. They've been, still battling this out, whether this is on a national level or an international level. It's so hard to get non-Indigenous states to really understand the situations that our people are in, and the need to not look at everything in such a scientific way, but to look at how you can incorporate Indigenous knowledge with science. Indigenous people are the people that know the land. They know where certain things are and what changes they've seen, and it makes only sense to work collaboratively with Indigenous people. And I think that's really all about the declaration, is that collaboration, that inclusivityness, but not just, in terms of Indigenous youth, but as a whole, the importance of working together. Because if you're not communicating, and this is, Indigenous people have been communicating so loudly for so many years that I think as youth, and this is just my perspective, as youth, we're just tired of it. We don't have the same patience as our leaders do, where we're like, okay, like we've heard this over and over again. We've seen this leader do this and this leader say this, and we've seen it all, we've heard it all. And now we're just like, we're done. We're like, okay, well, look at, we want to be involved. We want to participate actively. We want to be part of this change. We have ideas. We have potential solutions. Let's work together so that we can, move past this and start looking at it from a lens of cultural safety and land safety. And I think that's really the essence of this declaration, is that collaboration and the absolute need to be inclusive. Between all parties, not just being inclusive from an Indigenous youth perspective, but also the need for states to recognize that Indigenous people are the number one importance when it comes to the changes that are happening in the Arctic, because they're the ones that are local. They have the knowledge, they have the experience. And we've been saying we're willing to help here, but you need to be collaborative with us.
Thank you. I can hear the passion in your voice too. I get goosebumps for a second time. So we have about 3 minutes left. So I think we could take one more person if you'd like to contribute your knowledge and expertise. Or if you are ready, we can also start our break and we can get a little bit extra time for coffee before we go on to the next panel. Okay. I'd just like to thank you all for being here. Over the past 2 years, I think you all have been putting in a lot of hours in a time that is very difficult for the entire world. So I'd just like to thank you for contributing your time and your knowledge in this very, very busy time for the Arctic. And I really hope that that the audience that's watching now will scroll down. There's a hyperlink to the declaration from 2019. So you can go there and see exactly what these leaders before you. In addition, I think there was about 24 Arctic youth delegates at the Arctic Youth Leaders Summit. So please take a look and see what policy objectives they have more in depth and find ways to amplify these words, because as Crystal said, people have been saying these things for a very long time, and it just takes people listening to create more collaboration and work in these central policy issues. So with that, let's take a break. And for the rest of the audience, we'll reconvene in about 5 minutes at 2:10 p.m. Eastern for a discussion on infrastructure and sustainable development in the Arctic. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you got some good coffee refills. We are ready for our second panel, which is on infrastructure and sustainable development. And it will be moderated by Mr. Jack Durkee, who is a program associate with the Polar Institute and the manager of the Arctic Infrastructure Inventory through the Wilson Center. Jack, go ahead.
Great, thank you, Michaela, and good morning to everyone from Anchorage, Alaska, and thank you for joining the inaugural The Arctic in 25 Years, the International Youth Symposium. As Michaela said, my name is Jack Durkee, and I'm the program associate for the Wilson Center's Polar Institute, where I manage the Arctic Infrastructure Inventory, a database of infrastructure projects across the Arctic and other strategic initiatives. I will serve as moderator of this next panel and will do so on behalf of the Wilson Center's Polar Institute and our partners at Arctic Frontiers, the Arctic Council Permanent Participants Youth, and the Arctic Youth Ambassadors. I do want to give a quick shout out to Michaela Stith, who has brought this symposium from a vision to what we see today and has done all of the heavy lifting from our side. This upcoming panel will focus on infrastructure and sustainable development in the Arctic. More specifically, we'll focus on the growing interest in shipping, resource extraction, and foreign investment, all within the context of the impacts of climate change in the Arctic and what political principles, processes, and practices might accompany the shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative one. We'll also touch upon the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, the role of telecommunications in infrastructure, and how it can support traditional economies, and the characteristics of a robust consultation and engagement frameworks between developers and local and Indigenous communities. If you, the viewers, have questions or other topics you'd like the speakers to comment on today, please submit them to polar@wilsoncenter.org. That's POLAR@wilsoncenter.org. And we will get to your questions later in our discussion today. We have a fantastic lineup today to discuss sustainable development in the Arctic. First, in alphabetical order, we have Taylor Holshouser, Director of Business Development at the Alaska Ocean Cluster and a research fellow with the Wilson Center's Polar Institute. Second, Ruth Miller is the Climate Justice Director for Native Movement. Third, Artur Okoteto, Vice Chair of the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North Youth Council. Fourth, Chloe Scott, Research Associate, Arctic Program with the Clear Sea Center for Responsible Marine Shipping. And fifth is Ole Anders Turri, a reindeer herder and also works at the Sami Parliament in Norway. Viewers can find the speakers' full bios on the event webpage, which is where you likely are viewing the stream currently. With that, I think we are ready to go. So Taylor, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jack. And I'm going to share my screen here. Well, thank you, Jack, and thank you, Michaela, and thank you to all of the organizers of this conference. It has been very enlightening and enlivening so far, and I'm looking very much forward to this panel and the future panels. My name is Taylor Holshouser. I'm the Director of Business Development at the Alaska Ocean Cluster and a research fellow here at the Wilson Center. I'm here today to talk about a few things that we're doing at the Ocean Cluster, explain our approach to sustainable development, talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we see and opportunities, and also highlight some reflections, some lessons learned that we have taken in our time here. Here we go. So the Ocean Cluster is on a mission, and that mission is to grow Alaska's sustainable ocean economy. We define that simply as all economic activity that takes place in Alaska coastal waters to the exclusion of oil and gas and other kind of extractive industries. So that includes fisheries, tourism, mariculture, transportation, renewable power, etc. A little bit about what we do. So we work in conjunction with coastal communities, maritime ministries, and government agencies to accelerate ocean tech startups. And that can be everything from startups that are looking to scale to go from pre-seed to Series A, the typical venture capital route, or companies that don't have that scalable future. So those are small businesses to medium-sized enterprises that offer what we define as a solution to a known ocean problem or opportunity. Each startup joins our program kind of on an ad hoc basis, but we deliver for them a series of a package of services that can include data insights, strategic guidance, connections to key stakeholders. What we're trying to do is essentially take something from the idea stage to product deployment. We launched our first cohort here in January. We have 2 companies right now, one called Blue Ocean Gear, which makes smart buoys to attach to fixed line fisheries, so crab pots, cod pots, as well as long lines, and another company called Pole Arctic, which provides oceanographic and climate data using, or forecasts using machine learning and artificial intelligence. Right now, they're working on some sea ice forecasting to improve safety of vessels at sea, as well as operations for the interaction of industries and Indigenous groups in Canada. We also have a project that I can't announce, but which is in the works, working on full seafood utilization. So that's trying to take current seafood utilization from a rate of about 60% across Alaska seafood species up to 100%. So that's utilizing all of the fish. You may be asking, okay, why now? Frankly, it's time to act. Our oceans are reaching a tipping point. We're seeing this with majority of fisheries worldwide are being overfished. We're seeing it with climate change and the addition of carbon into the atmosphere leading to ocean acidification. We're seeing it with plastics. We're seeing it with unsustainable practices. The Ocean Cluster believes that technological innovation will be key to solving most of these challenges, with everything from IUU fishing to plastic waste to taking advantage of new opportunity, including multi-trophic aquaculture, precision fishing. That's integrating technological communication devices, integrating smart data analytics, integrating new material sciences into traditional practices. And we think that the Arctic is a great place to do this. We see in Alaska, I grew up in Alaska, I've spent a lot of time on the water. We see Alaska as a test bed for these technologies, and we really believe that through international cooperation and communication, as well as decreased travel barriers, we can really show the world what it means to do technological innovation properly. So this leads me to a bit of the reflections we've had so far. In our time at the Ocean Cluster, one of the things we're realizing is that teeny, small initial differences can lead to radically different outcomes, and you don't need to change a lot to radically alter the future. Small improvements in communications technology can lead to drastically safer vessel operations at sea. Small communications or small devices can lead to improved sustainable fisheries. We just need to start tinkering. And to tinker, really, we need to be able to distribute lots of bets across or a lot of money across lots of small bets. But to do that, we need to be able to have the public infrastructure, the basic infrastructure like roads, like ports, like broadband internet, to be able to communicate, to be able to travel. We need robust education systems so that tech jobs are coming from our communities, not from just global institutions, so that Alaskans can serve, and not just as workers, tech workers, but as tech founders. We need cross-border cooperation and collaboration, because ideas aren't always rooted to one place. They can be cross-border, and sometimes really great ideas emerge, but they need to be shared. And those kinds of best practices are best facilitated in forums like this. And we need risk capital to understand the Arctic and be respectful for the conditions and the requirements that needed to operate here. And that means having venture capital come to the state, come to the north, but understand that it can't operate the way it does in Silicon Valley or Southern California. It needs to be understanding of the conditions on the ground. And I always like to end with storytelling. This is something we recognize increasingly at the Ocean Cluster, that we need to be able to tell the story of the North. We need to be able to tell the story of the Arctic. We need folks to understand that there's a history to this place, and that there's a very long tradition of innovation, of technological innovation, of cooperation, that it's not just new lands, that things have been going on here for a very long time, and people have solutions. But we can all, I think, benefit when we cooperate. So I don't want to take too much more time. This is the much condensed version of my typically longer pitch. But I would say I would conclude with, we need to tinker, and we need to have respect for those that do, and respect for the people who are already doing it. So With that, I will turn it over to Ruth and back to the moderators. Thanks, guys.
Great, thank you, Taylor. Ruth, over to you.
Yachlidu everyone, Ruth Miller Gustanish Ijich u Chivak Isinch Iji, then in a kana chef kun kanash u Chakayangas Nanish Ite, Takayakak, Suguyas Dudach u Chikanikali Kidiki, Eko Kasnan Chukushakaya Kilandach u Chikanakiatal Henad Bagut Yachli at Sette. My English name is Ruth Miller. My Denali Athabascan name is Shavaik Isin, and I presently serve as the Climate Justice Director for a statewide Indigenous matriarchal nonprofit called Native Movement. But my family is from the Lake Clark region, where Denali, with some roots in Bristol Bay as well, and I grew up here in Denali territory in Takayakak in Anchorage, Alaska, and I'm so happy to be contributing on this panel. I was honored and just blessed to have the opportunity to listen in on the past panel with our Arctic youth representatives. And it's so always galvanizing and inspiring to hear from our Indigenous youth leaders. And I'm proud to stand with them. Today, when we talk about just transition, you know, I believe that I will be presenting a bit of a different perspective, and I chose not to use slides because I'd really like to encourage a bit more of a conversational style as we start to envision what just transition means for Alaska. And so, you know, speaking, we speak in my culture with our stories first. And so when just transition began circulating as language we were using in Alaska, first we have to recognize that just transition frameworks came largely from the labor movement of the 60s and 70s. And through Movement Generation, a really incredible widespread nonprofit that does a lot of civic engagement work, the just transition framework came to our nonprofit sector here in Alaska a number of years ago. But when we first began talking about just transition, transitioning our economy from an extractive economy towards a regenerative economy, we understood immediately that this does not just live in the realm of industry, technological innovation, in a corporate or business mindset. What is needed to transition an economy, meaning the management of home, from one of extraction and exploitation to one of regeneration, is deep healing. But it also means returning to our Indigenous life ways and our cultural and socio-political structures that enabled us to live in a regenerative economy for thousands and thousands of years. My people have been here for over 30,000 years on these lands. And so, you know, Taylor, when you mentioned, you know, the long history of technological innovation, that technological innovation began with us. And it was Indigenous innovation that first established reciprocal means, harmonious means of living with our Alaskan lands and waters and airs. And so when we first began talking about just transition, of course, the first thing that we did was we went to our elders and we said, what does this mean? What does this mean to us? What does this look like for us? And in the Benti Kanaga language of the Lower Tanana Dene, we were given the phrase Kotr'ethne, which means remembering forward. It means we remember. Just transition is remembering forward. It's taking Indigenous and land-based solutions that enabled our communities to thrive in reciprocal relationships with our lands and waters and one another, and to bring the value-based system and the justice lens that informed regenerative economies then, pre-colonization and contact, to now bring us to solutions out of the climate crisis that we are in now. And so when we think of Kotr'ethne, obviously remembering forward encourages us to look at the multiplicity of ways our society can engage in just transition, not just through new business ventures, but thinking about what type of relationship we want to have with our lands and waters and what is the role for each of us within that. So from these conversations, the Just Transition Collective was born, and we held our first Just Transition Summit titled Kotr'ethne in January of 2020, which feels like so long ago and also just the blink of an eye. At the summit, we gathered over 200 participants, including some of our really incredible movement leaders from the lower 48, to bring multitudes of different sectors together to talk about what just transition in art and activism looks like, what just transition in an oil economy to a regenerative economy looks like, what it looks like for fishing and subsistence, what it looks like for language revitalization and our educational and healthcare structures. And so really it's crucial that we think about just transition not as, learning how to engage sustainable development, but how to be willing to disengage exploitative and extractive practices and to begin to shift the mindset that we bring to our lands and communities towards methodologies of reciprocity and sustainability. So really, sustainable development is not really the vocabulary that I ever use when I think of just transition, because we need to also begin embracing the concept of degrowth and relocalization and how to tend to our community needs, particularly the needs of the Indigenous peoples and people of color and low-income folks who live closest to the land and suffer first and worst from the climate crisis. So, not only thinking about, what relocalization means from a business perspective, but how can we bring our workers along with this? What types of retraining will be necessary to shift our economies from oil and gas economies and towards sustainable growth models that also engage community leadership and Indigenous leadership. In our last panel, our participants might recognize, some of the discussion about free, prior, and informed consent, which is a crucial aspect of not just respect, but of any it's the baseline for Indigenous stewardship. It's the baseline for any economic development that hopes to contribute to a just transition, engaging the free, prior, and informed consent of all communities impacted, especially Indigenous communities, around any development project, including sustainable development models, including renewable energy systems, which will still take the extraction of minerals to support. And ensuring that it is the people who are living closest in relationship to not only our lands and waters, but of course the food systems that continue to perpetuate our life cultures, the vejek, the caribou, the denegi, the moose, the thika, the salmon, that are also going to be devastated, potentially devastated by even renewable energy projects if they are not placed well, if they are not constructed conscientiously, and if they are not engaging the leadership of our Indigenous communities. And so I really think it's important to be critical as we also think towards, creative new solutions to the extractive economy, and ensure that just transition is centered on justice and is centered on community participation and engagement in meaningful ways. And so to me, when I'm thinking of just transition, it's not only what policies and practices we must encourage, it's also what protections we must ensure for our communities that not only are the most vulnerable to the climate crisis and the most vulnerable to extractive development impacts, but additionally hold our greatest solutions and have 30,000 years of expertise and knowledge that direct what reciprocity with this land, with the Arctic, with Alaska can look like. And so I'll pause there because I'm really excited for our talking, our visiting. But Chikanik, thank you for letting me share, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Ruth. And I think you bring up a lot of important points about what sustainable development should mean in the Arctic context. And, we'll pick up the themes that were mentioned in the previous panel on free, prior, and informed consent later when we have the group discussion, but we'll get to more of that then. Next up, Arturo Cuteto, over to you.
Dear colleagues, my name is Artur Akateta. I represent RIPON at this panel discussion, and I'm extremely happy and honored to participate in this panel discussion. And I would like to tell you a little bit about myself. I come from the nomadic reindeer herding family in the Arctic. And besides presenting RIPON, I also represent the regional organization of youth. And I work in Yamala-Nenets Autonomous Region right now. I'm working with the indigenous communities on the indigenous issues in the Arctic at the municipal level. And as for the indigenous peoples who live in the Arctic, I think that today we continue developing the Arctic, and I think that we should find solutions, new technological solutions towards the development of the Arctic. As our previous speaker has mentioned, we should find solutions that will allow us to preserve the indigenous peoples on their traditional lands and not pose additional threats. And we should remember about the permafrost and other critical issues. For example, this year, in one of the regions, in one of the settlements where my parents live, all winter there was ice cover on the ground. And then it started raining intensively. And I think it is the sign of how industrial development influences the climate. And due to this reason, a lot of reindeer unfortunately died because they just couldn't get through this ice cover to their food, to lichen. And these problems that we face as reindeer herders, it is the result of the industrial development of the Arctic in the first place. And I think that we should find solutions together with the large enterprises who come to the Arctic, because some of them, they do help us, they do help reindeer herders. And that's why I think it is very important to negotiate, to have dialogues with the local authorities, with the people who live in the region. Because we say that large enterprises, they should be socially oriented, but I think that we should get this precise wording, that they should be socially responsible, not just oriented, because they should be responsible for what they do. They should be liable for that, because they should develop the infrastructure, but not abandon it afterwards, but continue develop it as well. And in general, you know, I'm not an expert. I come from the reindeer herding family. I live in tundra, so I won't dwell upon this issue any longer. It's just my personal opinion that I would like to communicate, and I hope that I will be able to make small interventions further on. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. Certainly able to have interventions once we get to the group discussion. I'll have a couple questions specific to you about you know, what Yamal LNG and that plant has done, if they have done anything with the indigenous communities in Yamal. Next, we'll go over to Ole Anders Turri for your presentation.
Thank you. I hope you all can hear me. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak to this event. It is a great honor. If you can just turn on to the next slide. I will talk from a reindeer herder's perspective, but with some other background also. As a reindeer herding living in the Arctic, we are heavily impacted by the climate change already, but we're also heavily impacted by infrastructure's development. If you just click one more. On my right side, you see a chart, a map over Northern Norway, and the first arrow points out our winter pasture. It's an inland winter pasture for our reindeer. And if you click once more, you will see our summer pasture in a coastal area near Tromsø. And click just one more. And I also work at the Sami Parliament as an advisor, working in the Department for Livelihoods. Today is Norwegian Constitution Day, National Day. Congratulations to all the Norwegians, included the Sami people in Norway. But it's also an important event this week for the reindeer herders. There's something that we call body squat that is happening now. It's the female reindeers are calving right now, most of the female reindeers. So that is a huge, not a celebration, in a way, a celebration for the reindeer herders, because then we are bringing up new lives in the Arctic, and reindeers, they are highly adapted to the Arctic. If you just go one more. Thank you. Before I started working in the Sami Parliament, I was a representative in the Sami Council for the working group in conservation Arctic flora and fauna that is founded in Arctic Council. I was there for 3 years in CAF, and I saw the benefits in how the Arctic Council has started to work together across countries, across regions, bringing people to the table, and in a civilized manners, discussing heavy topics, heavy research topics, and also trying to include the traditional indigenous knowledge with the science. And that's I hope for the next 25 years that we are working and trying to also make this cooperation better. Like it says there in one of my points, that the indigenous peoples are given a voice around this table. We heard in the previous panel the indigenous youth, the permanent participants talking, and they have a permanent role in the Arctic Council. This is something I hope we also can see more also nationally in the future, because some of the issues that are already been highlighted during these discussions are very big. Climate change, for instance, and for managing or trying to adapt to this climate change, we need all the people around the table. And next slide, please. So for the next 25 years, as many have already said, that Arctic Council, they are celebrating their 25 years, and Iceland is ending their chairmanship. Good work for them, and I have big hope for Russia when they take over. This is a picture actually of my father. It was taken in the beginning of 1950s, late 1950s, beginning 1960s. And he used to tell me that he experienced as a reindeer herder huge changes in the Arctic. In this picture, you can see he has this his reindeer and a sled behind the reindeer, because that was the means of transportation that they had. And he is actually then going around the herd and checking up the herd with his sister, actually. And he said during 1960s, engines started to come to the Arctic. And other means, telephone, communication along vast distances roads started to appear. You can say that these changes, they were human-made in a way. And also very often not, they were made without consultation or without dialogue with the reindeer herders or the Sami people. We also have the Sami fishermen and women, and in agriculture also as well. If you just click one more. This is a map over Norway and how the industrial development or infrastructure has affected the natural areas in Norway. It's from the beginning of 1900 to 2018, and you have like 5 kilometers space and that they are measuring from. These are not reindeer pasture areas that they have been measuring from. It's just the wilderness, if I can say it in that way. And you can see that in short time, actually, a lot of these natural areas has been reduced. Also, when we talk about the reindeer herders grazing lands, and this has a huge impact for the reindeer herders. Arthur Rocotetto, who was the speaker before me, he mentioned that they have infrastructure, but also they experienced this winter, and I'm sorry to hear that, rain on snow, creating icy condition, and many reindeer died. One strategy that reindeer herders often have is that we try to change then the pasture areas from one part to another, if such condition may appear. But if we have reduced the grazing areas, this strategy will not work for us. And then we are going to have to look at other solutions. Supplementary feeding will be one possibility, but it is very hard to give or try to feed up an entire herd long away from roads, snowy condition, also to get the feed to the reindeer herd. And also many reindeer herders are reluctant to do so because they mean that they think that the supplementary feeding will create an unbalance in the reindeer's condition, natural balance actually. For this, it was also mentioned renewable energy. We know renewable energy is a huge strategy globally to fight climate change, combat climate change, and also national strategies. But very often, marginalized peoples are bearing the costs for it. They are not invited to the table to discuss what measure could be taken, so they are not bearing so much of the cost on it. For the reindeer herders, this means that they lose the grazing land, and they lose the flexibility. And in the end, it can happen so that they lose their livelihoods, actually. And next slide, please. Sustainable development. I like what Ruth said, that sustainable development is that actually wording that is going to cover up the changes that we are facing in the future. Like her, I also don't believe so. Why I've taken this three models is that on the one on the left side, you probably all know, it's the root or the bearing child of the sustainable development. And in the middle, you have this UN Sustainable Development Goals. And that one on the right side, it's, I'm sorry to say, it's just on Norwegian or in Sami language. It's a model made for sustainable reindeer husbandry here in Norway from Sami Alaskor, from two of assistant professors there. My point of showing this one is to highlight that the Samis have some good thoughts, good models of how to be sustainable, like other indigenous peoples have in the Arctic, because they have lived in the Arctic, they have experienced the conditions in the Arctic. I will also like to just refer to the IPBES report on biodiversity and ecosystems. They have highlighted some major, issues that should be taken into account on their recommendations. B5, economic incentives have generally favored expanding economic activity that often have provided environmental harm. And for those that it hasn't, this economic activity hasn't taken into this account this regenerative economy that we are talking about now, given the time and space for the earth to heal itself. I recognize also a point here is recognizing the knowledge, innovation practices, institution and values for indigenous peoples is a point that they have highlighted in this report. And like many of the speakers before me have said, that indigenous peoples, they have knowledge about the Arctic. Bringing them closer together, working together, and giving them space will favor for a just transition, actually. That's one. If you go to the next slide. So what I ended with is this knowledge transfer between science and traditional knowledge. The traditional knowledge is, like it was mentioned in this previous panel, is rooted in this indigenous language. But there has to be done more for merging the traditional indigenous knowledge and science. And by that, we have to build up more institutions that works on the indigenous knowledge, methods, theories, and practice. Because we know that a lot of the people making the decisions, they are often not in Arctic. They will not often, but seldom in Arctic, and they are seldom visiting Arctic. We have to find means to get the information that we have to them. The second point is recognition of the indigenous rights I have written. And many have talked about the free, informed, prior, sorry to say, but FPIC, free, prior, informed consent. That is needed. The people who are going to build infrastructures or any kind of major technology infrastructure has to take account that the people living in the Arctic, they have rights in the Arctic. And for having this free, prior, informed consent, the FPIC, you have to invite these people, these marginalized groups, early into these processes, already in the plan. We are experiencing a lot that we are much too late in the processes. The plans are already made. The assessments, they are already made. And then we as indigenous people are coming and saying, no, but what about us? What about the consequence it brings to us? Then they say that, okay, what are your consequences? But they are seldom then taken into account because we are so late in the process. So already from the planning, we should be there. And for making a just transition to green economy or regenerative economy, there's just two things that I will say. Bring the marginalized groups early into this process and accept, take into account their message, their knowledge, and also use it for the next 25 years. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Ola Anders. Excuse me. And certainly we'll be looking forward to the discussion amongst all the panelists after this last speaker about free, prior, informed consent and how development should and needs to, consult and engage indigenous communities from the beginning so that it's sustainable for all the Arctic communities. But we'll get to that in a second. Lastly, but not least, Chloe Scott, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jack, and thank you to fellow panelists. I mean, that's everyone has made it a very tough act to follow, but I will do my best here. So hello, everybody. My name is Chloe Scott. I am from the traditional and unceded territories of the Squamish and Lillooet Nations, which is commonly known as Whistler, British Columbia in Canada. And I'd like to start off with kind of paraphrasing two common facts that we hear at various Arctic events and in our own literature. The first being that climate change is being felt in the Arctic at twice the rest of the globe. And the second, what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. So as my hometown mountains began changing because of climate change, I grew increasingly concerned not only for my own home, but for those in the circumpolar north. So when I began my Master's of Science Studies, I knew I wanted to commit myself to research that would make a difference while also fueling my own curiosity. I landed on the topic of increased maritime traffic on the Arctic blue economy, and what began as an academic interest soon gave way to passion. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we hear the term blue economy often when discussing the changing Arctic, but what does it actually mean? Is it a buzzword or is there something deeper there? The World Wildlife Fund's Arctic program produced a report in 2018, which provides a comprehensive definition from which I like to work. The report defines the Arctic blue economy as one in which the Arctic's marine economy is founded on the principles of ecosystem-based management, circular and renewable technologies, and inclusive governance processes. Well, that's a lot to wrap one's mind around. But in essence, the blue economy looks at the world's oceans as a new, although new is debatable, source of economic opportunity. But in doing so, it understands that in order to remain sustainable, there needs to be a holistic understanding and approach taken to how and why different oceans are used by different rights holders as well as stakeholders. Next slide, please. So these are some of the questions I set out to answer in my master's research, but upon graduation, I found I had more questions left than answers. Fortunately, I was granted the opportunity to complete an internship with Clear Seas Center for Responsible Marine Shipping. I was able to explore my questions further, but also was introduced to so many more avenues of Arctic exploration. So I'm now a research associate responsible for Clear Seas Arctic program, where our research explores the social, environmental, and economic impacts of marine shipping. Although our physical office is located on the west coast of Canada, we really are dedicated to research that spans coast to coast to coast. With an understanding that Canada's oceans are used and protected differently by different Indigenous rights holders as well as various stakeholders, we as a team began the process of digging deeper into our own understandings and biases, as well as blind spots. Next slide, please. This work has been guided by our Indigenous and Coastal Communities Manager, Sarah. Together with Sarah, we have explored myriad topics to aid us in our journey of reconciliation. As a team, we found it helpful to develop our own capacity as researchers as well as science communicators through literature. Our Indigenous book club was formed, and we have held some incredible conversations guided by nonfiction as well as fiction works. Collectively, we've harnessed a growth mindset because being comfortable with being uncomfortable is key to having some of these conversations. Growth is uncomfortable at times, but by creating space for team members to learn more about historic as well as contemporary Indigenous issues, both within and beyond the scope of ocean science and governance, we're better equipped to create ways of ensuring that Indigenous voices and traditional knowledge are infused in all steps of the research process. Next slide. By leading with a growth mindset as a researcher, it becomes easier to shape questions that are guided by problem solving. So getting curious and finding out what people need in order to make their lives easier can lead to some exceptional research opportunities. Next slide. Our academic partners at the University of Ottawa recognize this and are conducting a study on weather, water, ice, and climate, commonly abbreviated to WWIC, and ship navigation. Due to climate change causing rapid change in the Arctic environment, including melting sea ice and ice mobility, shipping through and within the Arctic has increased. As shipping continues to grow within the Arctic, so too do the risks. Our partners at University of Ottawa have heard from mariners that weather forecasting has been a significant challenge in navigating the Canadian Arctic because often there's no real-time data observation available. Limited communication infrastructure compounds this issue for mariners. Aimed at addressing this current usability gap, Drs. Jackie Dawson and Jean Holloway, with support from us at Clear Seas, are releasing a mariner survey, which will collect feedback on what is currently in use, what information sources are most reliable, and what user needs aren't being met. Next slide, please. The global interest in exploring as well as exploiting the valuable resources in the Arctic is continuing to grow. As it grows, it will be up to policymakers to balance the protection and usage of the Arctic Ocean. As already discussed by my colleagues here today, another balance is needed. We need to work collectively and thoughtfully to balance Western science with traditional knowledge so that policymakers can be informed. I will end by using this quote by the author of The Little Prince. As for the future, your task is not to foresee it, but to enable it. As the Arctic's emerging leaders here today and listening in, and through events like this one, where the silos are knocked down between scientists, policymakers, industry professionals, advocates, and activists, we're better equipped to enable an Arctic where sustainable growth models are really shaped by those in the Arctic. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Chloe, and thank you to all the panelists for your introductory comments. The theme was brought up in the first panel of this symposium that we've picked up on more in this panel, the idea of free, prior, and informed consent. New developments are being developed on Indigenous lands, and that removes ways of life, language, food sovereignty, etc. And so there's obviously a need for free, prior, informed consent, not to be told what is happening, where is happening, etc., but to participate and obviously express concerns as well. So we've had a lot of discussion on that so far for this panel, so I want to dive into that within the context of the characteristics of robust consultation and engagement frameworks between developers and more southern entities and local or Indigenous communities. So does anyone in particular want to take that first?
I can begin by just starting us off. A huge part of implementing free, prior, and informed consent, of course, is having these policies ratified and adopted at the international, national level. But additionally, Native movement is so proud to engage with really deep community work and working with our own tribal leadership to help curate understandings and points of intervention into this process so that we are also exercising our rights as sovereign peoples and as sovereign nations. And so actually, I would love to share just a brief image, if possible. Our incredible kind of artist in resident, Jesse Thornton, helped us create this image about free, prior, and informed consent. And it's not only, an attempt to communicate this policy in a much kinder and softer way that describes our not only our sovereign power to intervene and to determine what health means for our people and for our lands, but really crucially, free, prior, and informed consent also means that we have the right to say no, and that right is respected and implemented in project proposals. And so if the Indigenous community determines that a proposed project, a development project, whether it's contributing to green energy or not, is devastating to the local ecosystem, then their lives are prioritized over the promulgation of this development project. That is a crucial concept, the right to say no, as well as the right to consent to development is really, really crucial. And I think is unfortunately, a really regrettable and disappointing sticking point for a lot of folks. But what we are attempting to implement in a just transition is a fundamental shift of power. It's a reallocation of power and decision-making power and resources. And so if we're not willing to consider what deep decolonization means in our industries, in our economies, then we're not approaching just transition, because just transition cannot just mean, a shift from our modern forms of exploitation to new forms of exploitation. Something that we say often is that change is inevitable, justice is not. And so really implementing fundamental intervention points and respecting them and being willing to shift that decision-making power is really crucial as an aspect of ethics. But I'll pass it over to my brother who I see has his hand raised, and I'll stop my share.
Yep, Willow, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you to Ruth. It was a very nice drawing. I agree with what Ruth are saying. The ability to say no is crucial regarding FPIC. On the other hand, also what I see for marginalized group, also in many times, to be able to say no, to be able to enhance all the information that are coming for all of these projects. Many times we have to think about building up the capacity for these marginalized groups, build institution, so they can have the capacity to understand the information, to work with it, but also then be able to inform the decision makers in also their language, because often we get this language barrier. We say the same words, but we don't mean the same thing many times. And it is often so that the decisions maker are not taking into account our language, our culture, our way of doing things. So we have to inform the decision makers in their language, in their customs. It makes it very difficult. So in the future article, I also hope that we can meet to have the same time to build a common language on having a sustainable Arctic in the future, regarding also then the free, private, informed consent, but the possibility to say no when the project is having so major negative impacts has to be there. Even though marginalized group has to be able to say no and respect it for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola Anders. Arthur, I want to go over to you, one for just a general response that you have to what's been said so far, but two, the Yamal LNG project is occurring on the lands that you all live on, and so if you have any thoughts on whether they, meaning that project, has approached your community, in the context of free, prior, informed consent as well. So both a general response and then about Yamal LNG as well, if you have any particular thoughts.
Спасибо большое, Джек.
Thank you, Jack. Actually, there is not only Yamal LNG, there are much more projects there. There are several companies that are operating in the territory of the traditional livelihood of our peoples. At the moment, I can say that the situation is more or less fine. We have common communicational opportunities, so we can find some mutually beneficial resolutions. For example, in one sector of tundra, there was this ice, as I've told you. So these companies urgently agreed to help the local reindeer herders. And it's important to understand that the reindeer herders don't have communication. They live in their reindeer tents, and they go to the cities for supplies very rarely. And so the companies helped a lot. They bought the feed for the reindeers. They also provided food for the people. And currently, the rain herders are also using the snow motorbikes, and so the companies helped with the fuel for these snow motorbikes as well. So when there was this urgent situation, the companies helped a lot. And we are grateful to our elders who decided to get united and created the organization that I represent, Yamal for Descendants. Of course, many issues are still outstanding, but together with this, we can see certain progress in terms of communication with the local companies. And I know that our issues are on agenda on the federal level. And for example, there is a law which is adopted related to the territories of the traditional livelihood. So we can see that there is a certain work on that. But of course, I agree with what the preceding speaker said, that we need to think about certain alternatives to what we have. We need to think about more clear energy. We need to see we need to think about methods that can help us to preserve Arctic and to keep the traditional knowledge. And there is another important issue. We need to understand that our youth is living in the modern world, and the indigenous youth is a kind of people who are talking on behalf of our peoples. So we are actually uniting two worlds, the traditional knowledge as well as the modern situation. So we need to think how we can incorporate the knowledge of our ancestors and use it in our life. So when I look at the nomads, I see that they change their ground and they travel along the area. And traditionally, people organize the camps on different locations. So they were changing it. But currently, the youth is not aware about that, and this may have a negative impact on the grazing grounds. So we need to keep the traditional knowledge, we need to transfer it to new generations. And I, on my level, want to organize the work on that and communicate with the youth. I cannot say that I'm an expert in the academic part of all these processes, but I'm a practitioner and I observe the life of reindeer herders. So this is what I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Artur. And that last point is critical, to get the view of the practitioners and bring that in concert with the developers and the academics, and to make sure that all of these processes, including infrastructure and sustainable development, are beneficial for all involved. Considering we have about 15 minutes left for this panel before we end for today, I want to get to another question, but before that, I should offer Taylor and Chloe a chance to comment on this last question too. So sorry for almost going too far ahead, but Taylor, Chloe, do you have any thoughts?
I think one of the pieces that comes up for me is being a researcher from the South, wanting to work as, in alliance as opposed to, coming in and saying, this is what we're going to do. I think one of the things that we've been learning through our own organizations, Indigenous reconciliation process, is learning how to use our position to empower others and let that drive the research. And hopefully that will then be used to inform policymakers, inform governments, and really put a spotlight on where these issues are for people. There's some really great examples out of some of our academic partnerships, like University of Ottawa. The low impact shipping corridors is one initiative where they've really gone out and consulted in community, let it be community driven. And I think hopefully, as we engage in forums like this, there'll be more awareness about how to do that in a respectful manner. And I think that's something that I'm really looking forward to in my career, is driving that forward and really advocating for the research to be community driven. Taylor, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Chloe. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have many thoughts here. One is, when we look at kind of the history of modern technological innovation, especially in the Arctic and Alaska fisheries and coastal communities in particular, one thing that does a trend that stands out is that more often than not, technological innovation that has significant impact on local coastal residents does not occur in, or does not come from local coastal communities. So, when steel boats arrived, when radar arrived, when radios, these things came from outside of the communities, and they had a tremendous impact on them, sometimes positive, sometimes not. And one of the things we're trying to do at the Ocean Cluster is to change that process to some degree. So instead of arriving with a new technology and saying, hey, here's this new thing we think it's going to drastically improve, safety, security, whatnot, instead starting with the communities and saying, what challenges do you face? What problems are you seeing, and what opportunities have you thought about and would like to see developed? And then bringing all the stakeholders to the table, but letting the communities drive that. And so what we're seeing right now in the Bering Sea with bycatch, for example, where community halibut fishermen are saying there's got to be a way to reduce bycatch. And it's not happening from us, it's happening on factory trawl vessels. Going out and looking around the world and saying, okay, who has technology that can reduce that? And then bringing it back and giving the communities ownership over that, some of that technology, or at least a say in how it's implemented, is really important to us. And the other thing I find really encouraging about some of what our portfolio companies are doing is, especially one that's operating in Canada right now using AI/ML forecasting techniques, is just how easy, frankly, it is to integrate traditional and Indigenous knowledge into the process up front. So what we see happening with sea ice forecasting and bathymetric mapping, for example, using satellite-based data, is that a lot of it depends, the results depend on the inputs. So it's the classic modeling of, garbage data in, garbage data out, well, good data in, good data out. And in one case, very recently, one of our portfolio companies worked with an Inuit Heritage Association to help them map their coastal resources to better understand their own subsistence economy, and saying, tell us what you define as by these regions. Where do you harvest kelp? Where would you want to put in, if you wanted to establish an aquaculture, pen, where would that go? And then taking that and extrapolating it and building it into the model, rather than saying, here's the model outputs, how is it relevant to you? It's saying, tell us what the relevant definitions are. What do you define as sea ice? What do you define as habitat? And we'll build the model around that. And I think that's a trend we haven't seen in large technological or large sectors of the technology world. And I'm really excited to see more of that happening, especially as we see the dispersion of some of the costs here come down, and the techniques, just kind of the sophistication, really increase, but be able to do it, 2 or 3 people, rather than having to go to Seattle or having to go to Palo Alto to get these kind of techniques. So I'll pass it back to you, Jack.
Great, thank you. I got left, I do want to touch on a topic that had been discussed throughout this panel, the issue of climate change. And the question is, how should policymakers, how should practitioners, et cetera, balance the emerging opportunities with risks posed by climate change? One example could be the blue economy in previously ice-covered oceans. Also just more generally about how to balance the need for development, the desire for development with the risk associated with that. So I'll open it up to anyone. First come, first serve.
Jack, I can jump in here with a real quick point. Promise to be succinct this time. I think first off, quality data. Before we do anything, getting the data to understand both as a baseline what is already occurring, but then also improving the data for more dynamic management. In the past, when we look at, like, say, fisheries, for example, right now we manage fisheries in a static way. So we send out annual observers, we do annual stock assessments, and then we let people go out and fish. And then we come back and we say, okay, well, what happened in the year since we last did our stock assessment? Given the proliferation of technology, remote sensing, smaller devices, the ability to manage extremely large data sets, we could move towards more dynamic stock assessment, more dynamic management. And that is something that I would like to see integrated across different sectors, not just fisheries, to essentially be able to say, let's do this in real time rather than in discrete events. And I think especially as we start looking at what does, say, a renewable wind farm, what kind of impact does that have on reindeer herding, being able to say, okay, let's do some continuous development of the data before we even start trying to build stuff, and building in a lot of the stuff we've talked about here with consent, but also allowing the data to be able to be informed. And I think there's really cool stuff happening right now with, like, TK and traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge data that's more qualitative being built into some of these data sets. And that's really exciting to see.
I can jump in with my perspective on this question as well, which is it's a big one, and I don't really have an answer. But one of the kind of moments that made me realize that is I was tasked with writing a blog about black carbon in the Arctic, and I thought, oh, that's going to be easy peasy. I'll do some desktop research, and it'll be up online quick. And it's become a whole team effort in understanding the complexities around black carbon, the science behind it, the elements of kind of the socio-cultural elements, the economic elements, and it became a much bigger project. But I think that's a sign of where sometimes there's these issues where we say, oh yeah, like, have we covered climate change, community consultation? Yeah. But you have to go deeper, and tackling topics like the blue economy, like climate change. There's so much information out there, but there's so much more to learn. And it's not just as simple as kind of checking the checkbox list. There really needs to be an iterative process that goes into these kinds of work.
Thank you, Chloe. Ola Anders, you've got your hand raised.
Thank you. Yeah, it is a hard question you have given us. Well, like Chloe mentioned here, that I think the processes in the future, they have to be bigger before starting on projects in the Arctic, because there are many issues that we have to look at before a project is even started, and it's the impact on the land, on the sea, the cumulative effect of it, and how it affects biodiversities, not just in the area that, like, an infrastructure is built or within the possibilities, but also cumulative. Are there other areas affected because there are changes in species way of moving, changes in people's way of moving, and also the social effects of it, how it affects even positive but also negatively people in the area and other area around it. Of course, this will make these pre-studies more expensive, much bigger. But if we are going to have a just transition, that's the way I see it. We have to work on in the future.
Absolutely. And I think, just briefly building off of those last two comments in particular, what we're asking for additionally is that collaborators and guests to our lands come with the humility to learn, the humility to understand that they will not have our land-based homegrown solutions, but can come with an excitement and a humbleness that allows them to learn from our generations upon generations of knowledge and cultural understandings of our places, so that they can not only, you know, say, oh yeah, we know about like TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, but we're actually engaging it in the manner that it was meant to be taught in. And fundamentally, that is relationship building. That means being patient and taking time with people to sit down and visit. You know, our elders do not move at the same pace as, you know, an EPA permitting process. And so understanding, you know, the ways in which engagement can be the manifestation of the just transition models we're trying to implement is really, really crucial. And taking that time, you know, like Chloe said, not to check the boxes, but to humbly learn, and to sit down with an understanding that you will be interconnected for not only the duration of this project that is being proposed and this collaboration that's being proposed, but to see its impact long after, and to understand the generational impact, not just even, you know, in our generations of Indigenous communities, but generations of our caribou and reindeer, generations of our fish, generations of our plant relatives. And so fundamentally, it's also a mind shift that's necessary, an ideological shift that must undergird all efforts at just transition or sustainable development.
Arthur, do you want to comment, or do you want to move on to wrapping up? Let me know if you have any comments.
Да, согласен. На самом деле.
Yes, I totally agree with the previous speakers, because, you know, maybe 25 years ago, we as Indigenous peoples, we had to face the following issues, because the development of the territory was not legally regulated. There was no legislation, and they were coming to our lands without asking us, without asking for consent. And I think that one of the pivotal moments was the legislation that the country introduced. And I think it should be part of any legislation that entrepreneurs and industrial companies that come to the territories must sit at the same table with the Indigenous peoples and discuss. And it should be supported by the scientific facts, by science and knowledge. In general, I don't have any specific comments. I would like to express my agreement with the previous speakers, with my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, we will go ahead and wrap up today's panel and today's the first day of the Arctic in 25 Years International Youth Symposium. I do want to offer each of the panelists a brief opportunity to share any final remarks before we turn over to Michaela. So Taylor, we will start off with you.
I'm going to yield my time so others can talk.
Chloe?
I just would like to take the opportunity to say thank you to everyone for a great discussion and really insightful presentations, and thank you to Jack and Michaela for bringing us together today.
Thank you, Chloe. Arthur, any final comments? Seems, there you go. Hi, Arthur, do you have any final comments before we wrap up the panel?
Спасибо большое.
Yes, dear colleagues, thank you for the invitation. And, you know, I was traveling, and the first part I was also there, but unfortunately I was on the flight and then on a taxi. And today I finally checked in my hotel and was able to participate eventually. And that's why it was a little bit difficult for me to speak at times. And I think it's a great honor for me to participate in this panel discussion, and I hope we will be able to meet in the future as well, and I will be able to communicate with you. Thank you.
Yeah, well, we see this as the first of an ongoing series of discussions with the Arctic Youth. So we certainly look forward to future conversations with you. Ulla Anders?
Yeah, like the others, I would thank for the opportunity and just highlight what I said in the beginning. I hope this is one of many symposiums in the future that are built on this way, that we build on knowing each other, understand each other, and by that prosper and have a sustainable Arctic. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Ruth?
Yeah, Chicken, thank you all so much for this time together. And I do hope that, we're planting seeds here, right? These conversations will continue. They must continue. And respectful collaboration, it makes me really hopeful and really excited to see all of the different aspects of this conversation that are coming alive. My language, we are working as one. So Chicken, thank you all so much. And thank you as well to the folks that have tuned in to share this space with us, and as well Chicken to our organizers. I'm with you all, and I hope it's the first of many such conversations.
Cool, thank you, Ruth. And I do want to thank all of the panelists on this panel, the previous one, for sharing their time, experience, and knowledge with each other and with the people tuning in today. So with that, I think that wraps up this second panel of the symposium on infrastructure and sustainable development. I want to thank you all once again for participating. And Michaela, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jack. And the last panel, I think these are discussions that we all need to be having and listening to. And being here at the Wilson Center, it may be that some of you watching may not have heard of Just Transition before, or have listened to an in-depth panel about free, prior, and informed consent. And so I really encourage you to take what these panelists are saying, that relationship building is a core part of a just transition. And here before you, you've seen over a dozen different, very smart, very capable young speakers. And so I would encourage you to continue reaching out, building relationships, and learning more about what you may not know about, and continuing the collaboration that we see here. As we know, many of these different discussions, from climate change to infrastructure and sustainable development, are more interconnected than we could imagine. And so I hope you will tune in tomorrow, where the first panel, we will have an in-depth discussion about climate change and biodiversity action and research, with a focus on co-production of knowledge between researchers, activists, and local community members, and Indigenous peoples particularly. And we will have a panel as well on political leadership, with some already elected officials, some government administrators, and young activists. So we have another great, robust day coming ahead. And so we hope you will join us. And we thank you for joining us today.